Our next guest is Stuart Anderson. He was co-lead counsel with partner Dan Westbrook, successfully litigating a case against the South Carolina Department of Corrections. They presented evidence that SCDC's mental health system was constitutionally deficient in such areas as crisis intervention, solitary confinement, clinical staffing, record keeping, mental health screening, use of force, and medication administration. You might have referred to this article that appeared in The Atlantic last year. It was called The Appalling Story of South Carolina Prisons. The state judge who ruled in that case, Michael Baxley, a state judge from Columbia, a former legislator as well, called it the most troublesome case he had ever come across. And he concluded that failure in this particular case was on everyone, all the good people of South Carolina, who could have remedied what they knew was a terrible problem since at least 2000. Where was the state's medical community while the reports piled up chronicling mistreatment of these prisoners? Where was the state's legal community as government lawyers walked into courtrooms year after year with frivolous defenses for prison policies? Where were the religious leaders, the ones who preach peace and goodwill? Where were the leaders of the community who cared? Stuart Anderson took on that case, and he is here to talk about it tonight. Please welcome him to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. You know, courts exist in our system of government to do two principal things. One is to correct wrongs when they've occurred. The other is to determine how government should work when it's been broken. The case that Judge Michael Baxley heard in 2012 and issued a ruling on in January 2014 addressed both of these problems. But fundamentally, as Mark gave you the introduction that he did, the perception was that it really was a failure of government that produced the problem we have today. What I want to do is talk to you a little bit in the 20 minutes I have before we break down into a panel with the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections and the Commissioner of the Department of Probation, Pardon, and Parole as well, is to give you some history and some context to help you understand what occurred and begin thinking about why it occurred, and more importantly, what in the world we can do to ensure that not only corrections functions well, but all of our systems of government work the way they should, and what your role can be in that. In his order of January 2014, Judge Baxley, who is now retired from the bench, and this is one of his last cases, found that there were over 3,500 inmates with serious mental illness in the custody of the Department of Corrections statewide, and that the organization representing the interest of individuals with disabilities in South Carolina and a class of those individual inmates filed the lawsuit 9 years before the wheels of justice do indeed too often move very slowly. The trial was heard in 2012. Judge Baxley issued an order in 2014 finding that the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment in South Carolina was violated. South Carolina's Constitution has a prohibition that's similar to the Eighth Amendment prohibition that some of your children, as you were doing what Sheriff Lott accused some of you who didn't raise your hands, might have been doing, had say, wait a minute, I've got some constitutional rights. Well, in South Carolina, you have those constitutional rights as well. We have a counterpart to the Eighth Amendment of the state constitution. Judge Baxley found that that constitutional provision was violated. It was violated because the individuals were exposed to a substantial risk of serious future harm, and the state had been deliberately indifferent to that risk. They had known about it and failed to take any reasonable steps to abate those risks and the damage that occurred. The Judge Baxley, in his 50-page order, then directed the department to correct and come up with its own plan of correction those constitutional violations in the next 6 months. We're now nearly 18 months later, but as you'll learn more about, the plaintiffs have been working with the Department of Corrections under the new leadership that following the issuance of the order, Brian Sterling, as director of the Department of Corrections, has helped guide from the Department of Corrections perspective. We'll talk about that in a moment, but first let me give you a little further background. Judge Baxley said, as Mark quoted him, that he looked at over 14 years, 70,000 cases, and by far and away, this is the most troubling set of facts and violations of law that he'd ever seen. Inmates had died in the Department of Corrections care for lack of basic mental health care, and that hundreds more were at substantial risk of physical injury, mental decompensation, as well as profound permanent mental illness, where their conditions have been exacerbated by being in the custody of the state. Well, how do we get here? There have been national and state developments that you've heard about in part, for those of you who were here last week, that we're going to review just very briefly. And I want you to think about what inferences there are from what we talk about today about what can be done to right the ship, to put the department back on course, how we can prevent the recurrence of these things from happening in the future, and what lessons we can learn to apply that to general good government. First of all, just very high-level brushstrokes. I'm sure this was examined in more detail last week by the professor from the University of Michigan, but that it was actually in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Dorothea Dix and her advocacy efforts resulted in the creation of the first American hospital for the mentally ill. 100 years later, the growth of services that were largely institutionalized for individuals with serious mental illness resulted in one psychiatric bed for every 300 American citizens. Those of you who may have seen in my generation One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest realize what became of those institutional efforts. I remember as a kid being introduced to Bull Street. And those of you my age will remember Bull Street in downtown Columbia and how folks were warehoused and spent years rocking away the rest of their lives on medications that didn't allow them in many cases to remember their name. Well, that movement, that in fact was spearheaded in large part by then Governor Ronald Reagan in California, formed an interesting coalition with community mental health advocates who wanted to get folks out of the psychiatric institutions that were hospitalizing individuals and medicating them so terribly heavily. And that coalition resulted in a movement that grew from the 50s into the 60s into its current day, where there has been an enormous reduction in the number of psychiatric beds available to American citizens, so that it's been a reduction by tenfold. So that there's now one bed available for every 3,000 American citizens. But what happened in that strange coalition of stranger bedfellows that was created was that there was an agreement that was made that was not consummated, that there would be institutionalization, and it would be matched by the redirection of resources from the institutions into the community to support the delivery of mental health services in communities in non-institutionalized ways, breaking down the prison-like systems of services that were provided. That system failed. And so what we found today is that prisons have indeed replaced psychiatric hospitals as our hospitals for the mentally ill, where, as was, I think Mark said, or one of the individuals said, 10 times more individuals with serious mental illness are in our nation's jails and prisons than in hospitals. 40% of individuals with serious mental illness, many of whom you probably have known or may be in your family, have encounters with the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. 40%, 4 out of every 10. And that on a permanent basis, nearly 20% of everyone, according to some counts, and many higher, and according to others, percent of individuals in prisons have a serious mental illness. Well, how did we get there in South Carolina? We see these national development that set this up, but it usually occurs on the development of concepts that there is some political base for and some overreaction to without the delicate balance that the chief referred to. And so the combination that we saw in the 80s with the Get Tough on Crime movement, and then coupled with the refusal to, the suggestion that prisons and human services and rehabilitation within prisons were a form of coddling prisoners and not punishing them. In fact, rewarding them for their criminal behavior, resulted in what became in South Carolina an absolute destruction of the Department of Corrections, mental health, and human service delivery infrastructure. Every system has a set of values and a set of internal delivery systems on which it operates and by which it's formed. South Carolina had among the leading programs in the country under some excellent Department of Corrections directors. With the introduction, however, of a former Texas state commissioner who became South Carolina's commissioner in the mid-90s, that over a very short period of about 4 years, that virtually every psychiatrist, professional master's level social worker, and psychologist was shown the door, fired, defunded, or just heard the message loud and clear that there was no room for them in that inn. And consequently, they left the system. The leadership then destroyed the mental health infrastructure in South Carolina. And that is documented. And in the Atlantic Monthly article where the nation read about South Carolina's history of not only the history of the failure of the Department of Corrections' ability to provide mental health services, but the government's failure to oversee that, to hold it accountable, to ask the correct questions, and then when it received the information, to do anything with it. That the history of that was documented by Judge Baxley in the order. It was introduced in the case. It was well known, but then conveniently forgotten by the legislators whose responsibility it was to be overseeing during the last 15 years the department's conduct. Consequently, Judge Baxley cited in his order the legislative studies that by the year 2000 were reviewing what occurred over the last 5 years. And the department retained a national specialist who said there's a profound crisis in the department. No action taken. That report was submitted to the legislature. A blue ribbon study was then retained by among specialists in the field, and that included the Department of Corrections and departmental health directors. They sat on that committee. That committee said they've had two important findings: that inmates, when they leave the custody of the department, are in worse condition than when they enter it with serious mental illness. They're in worse shape. We actually hurt them. And we is a correct way of framing that, because as we all know, we can't say that the police and the department protect us without saying we're also responsible for the effects of what it does in our name. Secondly, Judge Baxley found, as this blue ribbon panel had before it, that the public is being shortchanged by this. And if we're really concerned about public safety, the last thing we want to do is house mentally ill inmates who have behavioral issues, who have difficulty managing those issues, and then make them worse when they return to the community and have the freedom of movement within our own neighborhoods. And so consequently, what this agency found, what this study found, it's worth quoting: the public is being shortchanged because these inmates are eventually released, only to return to their local communities and commit more crimes secondary to inadequately treated mental illnesses. Well, that was the first of a series of reports that were submitted to the legislature before the lawsuit was filed. The Department of Corrections in 2003 actually retained a study from the Department of Mental Health. They said services were in disarray, there were extremes of poor care, inhumane treatment. This is one agency making a finding about another. This is not community advocates who were tilting against windmills. These were state-authorized agencies. In fact, this study was paid for by the department itself. Medications discontinued without physician approval, inadequate programming, mentally ill inmates in solitary confinement with little or no mental health treatment. Nothing had changed by 2010, when the Department of Justice investigated a complaint as well and found, on a more isolated basis, there's a lack of comprehensive chronic care that puts patients at significant risk of harm. As Mark introduced the issues to you, there were 8 different fields in which the Judge Baxley found constitutionally inadequate services. We don't have time to address all of them. I welcome you to go to our firm's website called Mental Health for Inmates, mentalhealth4inmates.org, in which you can get access to a copy of the order in more detail. But let me share with you a few things. One of the key, not surprisingly, issues to resolution of these problems is having an adequately trained staff in sufficient numbers. You can't do it without any people who know what they're doing, right? Well, and just to give you a sense of the comparisons, at the time of we filed the lawsuit, there were 2 FTE, full-time equivalent psychiatrists, maybe 1 full-time psychiatrist and several part-time psychiatrists employed by the department to serve 25,000 inmates. Michael Moore, the Department of Correction director who began the destruction of the SCDC infrastructure, took the position that they don't need psychiatrists. General family practitioners receive a round in psychiatry. They know enough to be able to order psychotropic medications when they're needed, and end of story. Well, fortunately, that's beginning to change under the leadership of the current director. But the department was in a huge hole. They were beginning to build out, and it's not an easy thing to do. This suggests that there is a ratio of 1 psychiatrist or psychiatric nurse practitioner for area and outpatient mentally ill inmates, when according to the American Psychiatric Association, that ratio should be about a fifth of that, or at 1 to 150 instead of 1 to 871. Psychologists was even worse, and psychologists function as kind of the backbone of most state Department of Correction systems. They do the programming, they oversee the delivery of services, they interface with the psychiatrists. They are the core. There was not 1 full-time psychologist employed by the Department of Corrections. They'd all been pushed away, and so the ratio was 1 for nearly 70,000 inmates, where the department's own expert in Kentucky, which is why Kentucky shown here, said they had 1 for every 800 inmates. So there was enormous deficiency of all mental health professionals, including an incredible dearth of licensed master's level counselors to have the day-to-day in the trenches interaction with inmates with serious mental illness. There were very few who were licensed, which is legal under South Carolina statute. It gives agencies a break to hire underqualified professionals who couldn't get a job in the private market. But it's okay. It's good enough for those who we want to protect society from. Doesn't make any sense except to save a few dollars. And when that's the principal agenda, then you get what you pay for, as in the rest of life. Another major area is, what do you do with inmates who are decompensating and at risk of suicide, at risk of hurting themselves or others? Well, the way the department has handled this historically is to do the only 2 things the department knows how to do, which in the trenches of the department, if you have behavioral problems, you respond to it with force and by long-term lockup. And that's what you got. It's like if you've got a hammer, everything you see is nails. Well, every problem they had required a response by mace usually not locking folks up for long-term, for rules violation, prisons within the prison. All right, I'm going to rush through this because I'm already beginning to move into the end of my time. I want to tell you about the standard method of dealing with a crisis that by definition is a mental health related issue, historically for the department, has been to strip individuals, men, and women would get a smock, take everything out of their cells. Because of the risks, they might be used to hurt themselves. There are many ways to handle suicide-related risk without doing this, but this had become the standard operating procedure for the Department of Corrections. So no mattress, cold, hard, concrete bunks to lie on, no clothes, no towels, no shoes, and often particularly in the dead of winter, awfully cold environments. Before I wrap up with a story about one inmate who was a client of ours, I want to give you this one little snippet of data that you can remember how bad things can be when we don't pay attention to what's going on. When I said that if there are behavioral problems, the department and folks who are not trained, and I want to take a second aside, in the same way of recognizing that law enforcement officers in our communities are well-intended, I believe that generally of the correctional officers. I don't know that I'd put it at 99.9%. I don't know what percent it is, but the great vast majority are. What happens, though, with a lack of training and with a lack of supervision and a lack of accountability so that when they make mistakes, they're not called on it. They're not held accountable. They're not taught what to do differently than what they're doing. What they do is continue the behavior that is the only thing they know how to do. And for inmates who acted out with mental health issues and histories, what they would tend to do is use more and more and more and more force. And that often was in the form of pepper spray that can create its own, as our expert witnesses said, physical risk in addition to the emotional crisis it creates. But the department had, according to its own data, 13% of its inmates were on the mental health caseload. Of all of the inmates, 26 out of the top 30 who were exposed to a number of incidents of the use of force were on the mental health caseload. 26 out of 30, system-wide, out of 25,000 individuals, when only 13% of them were mentally ill. What that tells you is what's obvious, which is that was all the department knew how to do in terms of managing their behavior, and no one was trying to change that paradigm. Well, that paradigm resulted in the death of one of our clients named Jerome Laudman in 2008. What you see here is a photo of a prison within a prison within a prison. Every prison has what's called an administrative segregation unit, where folks who violate rules are placed because of those rules violations for extended periods of time. And they can be enormously long periods of time, years on years on years. It's a solitary confinement unit, but euphemistically it's called administrative segregation. Those who are considered to be troublemakers within administrative segregation at Lee Correctional Institution outside of Bishopville have a further hole, a black hole, that they could have been placed into. And in fact, Jerome Laudman in February of 2008 was placed there. This is the antechamber of his cell unit. And this was the shower that didn't work, that was stopped up, that he didn't have any control of the water, that when water was turned on, it was turned on for everyone and just backed up several inches throughout the entire cell until the guards chose to turn it off. This was after the cell had been cleaned up, and a single container there that you'll see that served as his sink and his toilet. That was a prototype for the cells throughout the maximum security unit. Well, Jerome suffered from schizophrenia, mental retardation. He had a speech impediment. For reasons that no one who was interviewed in a SLED investigation following his death could ever say, was placed in this hole in the Supermax. He had already been in solitary confinement for over 7 months, over 210 days. He had not shown any history of being aggressive or being violent. His mental health counselor was not told that he was going to be placed there, yet he was. And this was the cell in which he was thrown into, hands cuffed behind him, face down. Not only once, but actually he was first put in the wrong cell. They pulled him out, they threw him back down again. A week after he had been there, he had stopped taking his daily meds. He had stopped eating his food. In the antechamber that you had just seen on the day of his death, there were no less than a dozen styrofoam containers of food that were molding and rotting that had not been taken out and he had never taken in. The morning of his death, the individuals who were in the cells next to him called the guards. The guards came, looked at him and said, "He's okay, he's just sleeping it off." He was face down, lying in his own waste, his own feces, his own vomit. He had been that way all night long. He remained that way all through the morning. Finally, the guards called 2 nurses. The nurses said as they were walking down the hall, and they never go there unless there's a crisis, it was the foulest smell they had ever smelled. The stench was so bad, they wouldn't go in the cell. It was so nasty, the guards wouldn't go in the cell. So what do you do when the guards and the nurses won't do anything? Well, you call other inmates and you make them go in and clean it up. That's what they did. They put him on a cot, they took him to the infirmary, they cleaned him up, they called an ambulance, and he was declared dead. Several hours later at Toomey Medical Center of a heart attack and secondary hypothermia. He had been neglected to the point of his death for reasons that no one could ever explain. Now, the department's defense was, well, that's an outlier. That doesn't happen to most of our folks, if any. That's the worst case you could find. And that's all probably true. But what it tells you and told us and told the judge about this system at the time was that they had no safety net, no system of reviewing what occurred, no rules and procedures that prevented this kind of death by neglect, if not active abuse, from occurring. This was the bunk that Jerome Lawman was laying under. And there were remedial plans, but I've gone over my time, so I'm going to dispense with that and ask Mark to take responsibility for the next stage.
Quick question, personal question, I guess. Nelson Mullins, Riley Scarborough, seen as one of the most powerful, influential law firms in this state, ties to huge big business and industry, international trade. Why take on a case of this nature? Why use up legal resources of a law firm of that magnitude on a case like this?
Well, there are many. That's a great question, Mark, and there are many different levels on which to respond to it, personal as well as professional. I'll begin with saying that our law firm has been wonderfully supportive, and it recognized and the leadership did through Steve Morrison, who I understand has been was a frequent speaker before his death, as well as Claude Scarborough, the longtime managing partner, who was a partner when I joined the firm, recognized the responsibility that corporate citizens have, including law firms like ours, to give back to the state, that we've been blessed in many ways, privileged in ways that we often forget, and that we have a responsibility to provide what we can to the community and to the state to actually help it function better.
Of course, the nameplate of the law firm also bears the name of one Richard Riley as well. His service to the state.
Yes, and I thank you for that nice hint. And let me just say, without being urged anymore, that Governor Riley joined the firm at the time that we started our pro bono program in 1990, and was the first chair of the committee, and took personal responsibility in ensuring its success. So he actually was absolutely critical to it as well.
Let me introduce Jerry Adger, who's had a long career in the prison system, or worked for SLED for many years, Department of Juvenile Justice for many years, now with probation, pardon, and parole. And also we have Brian Sterling, who is now the new head of the Department of Corrections, one-time Chief of Staff for Governor Haley, and a one-time Deputy State Attorney General. Brian, when the governor asked you to accept this job, there must have been part of you that thought, wow, what are you about to ask me to do? I mean, it's always tough to turn something down when someone like that asks you to do something, but you had to know what you were getting into.
Well, and a little bit about myself. I grew up outside of Boston, and my great-grandfather was kind of a joke, you know, an Irish policeman, and my grandfather was actually chief detective of homicide. So I've got on my mother's side of the family, there's a lot of law enforcement on that side. So I grew up kind of in a law enforcement family. And when I was at the Attorney General's office, I was actually one of the first pro bono criminal domestic violence prosecutors. I started with that program when Henry McMaster started it. So I, you know, have been involved in the criminal justice system one way or another for a long time.
Were you concerned at all, knowing the specter of this lawsuit was there, that major reforms would have to take place? Reforms, and let's face it, are going to take an awful lot of money to correct. And that's something that, you know, in politics is always difficult to curry support for.
Well, if I could give a plug to another Riley, when I came in and the lawsuit was, I landed on my desk, I read it, and, you know, I talked to my staff, and, you know, they said we should fight this, and, you know, they wanted to fight it, and I said, you know, we lost. I said, you know, we can still appeal it to protect our rights, but I want to sit down and I want to talk to the plaintiffs in this case. I was a private attorney for a while, and I saw the value of mediation and sitting down and talking to someone about issues and what we needed to do. So I wrote a letter to Stewart and said, will you all sit down with me? I'm new. I started in October. It came out in January. I haven't been confirmed yet. I would like to sit down, and I want to hear your side of things. I've heard my staff and what they've said, but I want to know what the plaintiffs are saying, and I think that has been very fruitful. So, you know, when the governor asked me to take this job, I knew it was a big job, and I knew one of the things she told me when she asked me is, you know, we need to go in there and we need to help reform these people. I want to see education. I want to see workforce training. And she's been supportive in the budget. She was supportive of our budget for this. You know, you say it's a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but, you know, what's the value of not doing it? 90% of these folks get out within under 5 years. So we have a choice as a state. You know, we can warehouse people and expect different results, or we can treat, you know, and work with them while they're in there, give them skills, GED, high school diploma, anger management, some other things that we can do with these folks and invest in them, or, and more likely than not, someone's going to be in this room, maybe a victim of a crime, and those folks are going to be coming back for a lot longer. So that's kind of the philosophy. We also have to protect the officers that are in there. Jerry was the IG when I first got there, and, you know, he would investigate when we had matters that were
Crimes within prison.
Crimes within prisons, Inspector General. And, you know, one of my hardest thing is hiring officers. And if we have people that are busy getting treatment and in class and learning skills and everything, then they say idle hands is the devil's workshop, and that's one of the things that we're trying to work on. Just want to mention on that Laudman case, that was that last case in January. I don't know if anybody knows this. I wrote a letter to SLED and asked them to investigate this matter, and now it's at the Lee County and Sumter County Solicitor's Office to decide if there's going to be any action taken. I was waiting on the Department of Justice to make a ruling, so the Civil Rights Division, it wasn't coming. I waited, and finally I just had enough, so I wrote a letter to Chief Keel and said, you know, will you take a look at this case, a serious look at this case? That's going to be up to the solicitor to decide what to do on that. And that's a 2008 case that, you know, it was 7 years, but I wanted to see what law enforcement said about it.
Well, what's instructive, and I'll use Jerry as an example here, because Jerry, I'm very familiar with your work and how much you care about the system. If we can use DJJ as an example of being in a similar type situation years ago, this was back in the 1990s, the quality and condition of the Department of Juvenile Justice was in such disarray that the federal government essentially took over the program. They were accused of warehousing juveniles. They would go to juvie, nothing would happen. Living in deplorable conditions, there was no rehabilitation, there was no education, there was literally nothing. Not until Judge Byers and yourself came along and were charged with putting that program back up on its feet. And it's one of the most underreported stories the state has to tell in terms of successful government intervention. Because Judge Byers came in there and I said, well, why in the world would you take this job? Because it looks so daunting. He said, very simple. What I tell people all the time, what you do unto the least of these. And that was his mantra when he went to look at those young people behind the fence, as they called it. Talk a little bit about how that was rehabilitated, the mindset that had to change, and the support you got from so many people.
Well, you know, coming into DJJ, I was somewhat like Brian. I was reluctant to do so. I had planned to retire as a sled agent and go on about my merry way. But the opportunity came, and I knew that the agency had its problems over the years, and the lawsuit was still there. And so I came in as their first inspector general, and my job was mainly to investigate. One of the things that was in, DJJ had been on the lawsuit for over 10 years. And one of the things they listed in that lawsuit was inadequate investigations and negligence, failure to fully carry out investigations of abuse and things like that. And so when Judge Byers came on board, I was there working as the inspector general. The previous director wanted to fight the lawsuit and was not getting anywhere. And Judge Byers came in and he decided that this lawsuit has been fought long enough in the courts. It is time to sit down with the federal judge and have a conversation about what it is we can do to make this lawsuit go away. We're going to do exactly what the judge tells us to do. And so that was what I inherited. And so when we got that opportunity to go in and make changes, the judge looked at me and said, you're the deputy you're responsible for these children, and we can't go backwards, we got to move forward. And so that's what I did. I basically looked at the information in the lawsuit and looked at everything that was listed. And we started coming up with what we call a plan of action in terms of addressing the issues in the lawsuit. And it was so simple. I mean, it really was just simple. It was hard work, but it wasn't rocket science. It was just really doing the right thing for children. I mean, I couldn't understand it. And so the first thing that you need to do in these situations is you've got to get your numbers down to a manageable number. If you have overcrowding in a prison, in any prison, you're going to have problems. Because when you're overcrowded, you can't get anything done. It affects your ability to be secure. It affects your ability to educate and provide treatment. It's the same thing if you're understaffed. If you're understaffed, that's what he's faced with right now, the fact that he doesn't have enough people. And so you have to get your situation in a manageable way to come up with a plan. So the judge decided, let's look at these kids, and let's see who really is supposed to be incarcerated. We knew from our research that the majority of these kids were recidivating. They were coming back. But one of the reasons for that, because they was in the deepest end of the system. And so we started looking at the children and said, okay, who are these children? And we found out a lot of these kids were in prison for dropping out of school, truancy, running rays, those kinds of things. So we're like, why are they in this part of the system? These are kids that just need help. And so that was my job, to get them help. So we got them out of there. We got them into community settings where children had an opportunity to live a normal life. And that's where they do well, when they're in a setting that's more normal. In the deepest part of the system, they don't do so well. So we identified those folks. And we also had, as the inspector general, I had to make sure that if a child was abused or mistreated, that action was taken immediately. So what I ended up having to do with a room like this, with all of the sergeants and the lieutenants, and the treatment staff, the school teachers, and I talked about a new day. I talked about accountability. I talked about the role of the inspector general, and we laid it out. And we just basically said we're going to do things differently, and that's what we did. We just changed the way. We had to change the mindset of the people, because basically what was happening was, what we found out was SCDC is the big prison. It's right next door. Well, these are children. They were modeling the SCDC stuff. Whatever SCDC did, that's what they did. So the simple thing was, folks, it's really simple. These are children. They're not adults. Why are we treating them like adults? And then I started to say to them, if we're just going to warehouse our children and not try to rehabilitate them, then you psychologists and you teachers and you rec therapists, y'all can go home. I don't need you. See, we don't need you if you're not going to rehabilitate. And so that was the wake-up call for them, that you're here to do a job, to rehabilitate, not to warehouse. And that was the approach we took, and that was what I was able to do to get them to listen and to buy in and to change, because most people are just resistant to some type of change. So I used that lawsuit to make the positive change.
Well, Brian, let me ask you, as you're charged with trying to rehabilitate this current system, is the main focus on the people who are already incarcerated, who are mentally ill, and identifying them and trying to find a pathway out for them to be productive citizens, or rehabilitating them inside the prison with more adequate care inside?
I think it's both. I don't think you can't, you need to rehabilitate while they're inside, with the hope that they're going to return to society and connect them with the services on the outside. We've partnered with SC Thrive to try to connect people with services on the outside, get their application ready if they've got mental health issues, hook them up with area mental health. Some of the other things that we're doing is we've trained we've got 100 officers trained in CIT training. I'm talking to other law enforcement about that. Crisis intervention training. The first weekend, it was a 40-hour training. We had folks come in, and we've used NAMI also. They came in also. This one was through the Department of Justice, but NAMI came in and trained also. The first weekend we had it, we had one of our officers, and we give them a little placard that says crisis intervention on there, or crisis support, so the other officers that may not know how to deal with someone that may be having an incident can turn and say, I'm turning this situation over to you, you're in charge, you know what to say, you know how to stand, you know how to react. Talked to someone at I think it was Kirkland Institution, I was swallowing a razor blade. I mean, that's, number one, it's safety of the offender. It's, if you're willing to swallow a razor blade, you're willing to hurt someone else. It's a cost to the state, because that's a person that would have gone out, ambulance, the whole 9 yards, and that person, went back and they received the counseling that they have. My biggest concern, and I've shared this with Stuart, and we sat down, we went to the legislature with a plan, 3-year plan. I didn't want to do it all in, you don't eat a sandwich all at once, you eat it a bite at a time, is finding these folks. I sat on a mental health committee with other mental health people from around the state, and South Carolina does not have enough mental health professionals. We're not turning them out of our schools, and they don't live here. And you're shaking your head there. That is a problem not just for corrections. That is a statewide problem, and I don't think it's specific to South Carolina. So we're going to get this money, and then we're going to go out. One of the things I asked for, legislature was very kind. The governor put it in the budget. Legislature funded it. Was a healthcare recruiter. People want to work in a prison. They're not looking on the state website for a job. So I said I wanted to go out there and find someone, and I was adamant about this, and the plaintiffs agreed that we need someone that can go out there and go to these schools and say, how would you like to come to the Department of Corrections? It's a great place to learn and do an internship. Because a lot of people that do internships, a lot of people here probably did internships or clerkships. They probably ended up working at that company. Once they get in and see the difference that they can make in these folks' lives, some of these folks have never had anybody to give them a hand up, or to help them out, or to say, you know what, this is what you should do right. And when I first got to corrections, I said, why would anybody want to be a correctional officer? And I believe for a lot of folks, it's a calling. They want to help these folks. They want to be in law enforcement. They want to help these folks. And that's what I'm going to go and tell people that want to come and work at Department of Corrections. I'm going to say, I want you to be part of the change, a positive part of the change for the state, and make a difference. Because these folks, 90% within 5 years, are going to be living next to you. Quick story. I had a buddy of mine, I was driving out first week, he's like, oh, why do we care about the people at Department of Corrections? I said, well, let me just, say your daughter's 14 years old. I said, in 5 years, she may be at Charleston at school, Columbia, Greenville. She may be in a library, or she may be in a coffee shop. She may illegally be in a bar. Who do you want sitting next to her? Someone that's been warehoused in an institution, or someone that's been given hope, someone that's been given skills, someone that has a job, someone that has discipline, and if they have mental health issues, someone that has learned how to cope with those issues. You have a choice. What choice do you want to make? And he said, well, I never thought of it that way.
Because it's a difficult thing to think about. I'll ask both of you real quickly here, Jerry and Stuart both. do you think in the end this is going to take a community-wide effort, public-private partnerships, communities deciding, yes, we want to be engaged in this issue, businesses saying we will take a chance to perhaps rehab through vocations, through apprenticeships, you name it. Those are the types of things that work at DJJ.
Yes, that's exactly what we need to do. As the director for probation, you know, we have already begun with the Sentencing Reform Act to do things differently with offenders. When people are out on probation 5 years ago, if they violated probation, we locked them up. We simply locked them up. It didn't matter what the violation was. But because of sentencing reform, which is now new law, it forces us to deal with those offenders in a different way. So now what we're doing is, it's what they call technical violations. You can't pay your restitution, or you gave the wrong address, you was in the wrong place, but you're not a threat to society. You're just having a hard time. So now it's a new day. We understand that in order to keep people out of prison, then we have to help them find jobs. We have to help them get educated, get the treatment that they need. So as probation agents, people coming in on probation now, they're coming through our system with a much better chance of being successful, because when they violate technically, we don't send them back to prison. We've reduced this prison population within the last 2 years for about 1,500 people.
Substantial.
Just substantial reduction, just because we're not locking them back up just because they can't meet some of the probation requirements.
Stuart, is part of this at the end of the day just the empathetic part of the human nature to see these people as real human beings?
Well, frankly, Glenn and the media have been wonderfully helpful in conveying that message, that these are real human beings, the kind of work that Peyton does in the community, the kinds of messages that are being sent, that every one of us and our families are vulnerable to the same sort of thing that occurs behind the walls of the Department of Corrections. And why I'm hopeful that the participation in the community, like events like this, will make a difference is understanding the interrelationship of the educational system with the correctional system, and why corporate citizens and individual professionals have an interest in all of us doing better. And that when one of us fails and when an element of the system is broken, the entire state becomes unhinged. And we've spent, as I think everyone in here would recognize, too much of our history being unhinged. And it's only by conveying the messages to our leadership in Columbia and in your own communities that you want it to change that it will ever change. But I'm hopeful that where courts can say, because the courts, and Nelson Mullins was involved in that lawsuit as well, we filed that for DJJ and the school case, and others would say, we have a systemic problem, and without all working together in our mutual interest, it won't change, that will result in change.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your insights. We sure appreciate it. Next week will be the third part of the summer series, Creative Justice in the Courts. We'll hear from the Honorable Brucey Hendricks, U.S. District Judge, and we'll also hear from upstate judges who are working to problem solve creative justice in the courts, giving judges latitude to come up with creative sentencing that doesn't always involve people being locked up behind bars. Again, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for our earlier panelists, and thank you for being here. We'll see you next Tuesday.